How's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so let me just jump right into it. So I think that one could argue that today, as a whole, we live more superficially than we ever have before. I mean, we live in a world where entertainment and social media and consumer culture dominate, and where so many of us continue to seek fulfillment in external distractions rather than confronting the deeper questions of existence and living in an authentic and committed way. And here, at least two very well known philosophers are particularly relevant. So I'm thinking of the 17th century philosopher, French philosopher, Blaise Pascal, and then the 19th century Danish philosopher, Soren Kierkegaard. Okay, so let's take Pascal first. So in his work called The Pensée, what Pascal does, and here I'm generalizing a bit, but at least in part, what he does is he contrasts a deep life with a superficial one. And for him, a superficial life, well, it's one mostly characterized by what he calls living in a state of diversion, which is just living in such a way where we're constantly seeking distractions. Distractions designed to avoid confronting the unsettling realities of life. In other words, Pascal thought that people engage in games and in entertainment and even in work, not merely for enjoyment or necessity, but in order to avoid thinking about their own frailty and more generally to avoid the most important of questions concerning human life. Rather than trying to seek answers to these questions and adjust accordingly, most of us instead, what do? We seek refuge by choosing a life of superficial engagement, content with fleeting joys. And by the way, this is why why Pascal thinks that we fear moments of silence and of solitude. It's why, as he famously puts it, we're unable to sit quietly in a room alone. It's because conditions like this force us to reflect on our own mortality and the sorts of weighty questions that define human existence. Actually, no, this idea of silence and solitude, this makes me think a bit of the contemporary philosopher Byung-Chul Han. And that's because for him, it's precisely through quiet, contemplative practices that we escape or break free from our superficial lives. Basically, what he argues is that things like meaningful rituals and slowness and silence can serve to counteract the constant stimulation of modern life, and so help us to reconnect with a deeper sense of being. Okay, well, the other philosopher that I mentioned at the outset, who had more than a few things to say about the superficial life, was Kierkegaard. So he saw living the superficial life as a way of avoiding serious reflection, like Pascal did, but also, maybe more importantly, he saw it as a way of avoiding the difficult task of selfhood and of responsibility. He called this superficial way of living in the aesthetic stage of existence, a stage he sees as inferior to two other stages he calls the ethical and the religious. Now, I've talked about the nature of these stages in other episodes, so here I just want to outline in very general terms the kind of superficiality Kierkegaard has in mind at the aesthetic stage. So for him, this stage is marked by things like incessant pleasure-seeking and a reliance on societal norms to define one's identity, and on the avoidance of responsibility and commitment. And so for him, basically, these are all ways of falling into what he would consider to be patterns of inauthenticity. And here's the thing. According to Kierkegaard, living like this, it has serious consequences. What it does is it brings us despair, even if we're not always directly aware of it at the time. In other words, Kierkegaard thinks that despair is the necessary and the ultimate result of living out a superficial existence. Okay, well, what is despair? Well, very generally, it's something like a sickness of spirit, one due to an internal imbalance. An imbalance between the self that currently is and the self that can be. It's when we're not moving in the direction of the person that we could be. As Kierkegaard himself says, despair is the result of not willing to be the self that one truly is. Or as one commentator puts it, it's when we fail to be fully a self. Okay, so how does this work then? Why do we eventually feel despair if we stick to the superficial life? Well, it's partly because when we're encouraged by things like mass media and public opinion and social convention to adopt inauthentic identities and to spend our time immersed in distractions, what we're doing is we're not only making ourselves susceptible to things that we have no control over, but we're essentially living passively. We're basically passive spectators of life rather than active participants in our own existence. Or to put it another way, we're distancing or alienating ourselves from the project of our true self, a gap which eventually brings on despair, even if it's not obvious at first. Actually, a good example here, at least from the world of literature, is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Here, of course, we get introduced to the spirit of the Roaring Twenties, where things like wealth and pleasure and social profile seem to be the ultimate pursuits. However, as Fitzgerald shows us, despite the external appearances and the glittery surface of things, the characters there seem terribly unfulfilled and morally hollow and ultimately unanchored. And actually, this reference to being unanchored, I think that's really significant. You see, for Kierkegaard, the first step out of despair is to start to take responsibility for oneself. But what that means is being willing to take on the weight of authentic human existence. And here, weight is important because the lightness of the superficial life, that might be enticing at first, and it might seem freeing, but at some point it becomes unbearable. A theme, of course, that's explored in Milan Kundera's incredible novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. It becomes unbearable because detachment and a lack of introspection only takes us further away from what we truly and ultimately need, which is to confront our potential and to connect to our true self. Bye for now.